I'm Paul Kellerman, 51 years old, Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at Graymont Infrastructure Group. I spend 70% of my time convincing government officials and municipal commissioners that Graymont can rebuild their roads and bridges better than anyone else in the country. I'm the guy who holds relationships together with duct tape, handshake commitments, and an encyclopedic memory of every bridge code in Virginia. I've been doing this for 26 years. Not because I love it, because I understand something fundamental. Infrastructure gets built by people who show up, who listen, who understand that a municipal commissioner's entire career depends on choosing contractors who won't screw them over. That respect, that willingness to care about their success, that's valuable. That's the most valuable thing you can bring to this industry. Richard Graymont hired me in 2008, right before the recession nearly gutted the market. He came to Charlotte himself to recruit me. We didn't become friends. Richard doesn't have friends in the corporate world. But we understood each other. For the last 16 years, I've been one of the 3 or 4 people Richard relied on to keep that company's pipeline alive. He built Graymont from a small regional outfit into something that moves $3 billion in annual revenue. He's not warm, but he understood something fundamental. At the highest levels of business, relationships win contracts. And he understood that I was the guy who won those relationships. 16 months ago, January 2025, Linda Martinez called me from the Virginia Department of Transportation. I've been cycling through her emails and lunch invitations for about 2 years before that call actually came. But we'd built something real. Trust. VDOT was about to request proposals for the largest transportation project they'd authorized in a decade, the Commonwealth Bridge Initiative. $1.2 billion. Not million, billion. When Linda called, it wasn't just courtesy. Graymont had been pre-selected as one of 4 bidders. Pre-selection. That doesn't just happen. It happens because of exactly what I'd been doing. 2 years of quarterly lunches with Linda, Thomas Chen, and Commissioner Walter Prescott, a man who'd spent his career in public works and had zero patience for companies that cut corners. Pre-selection meant VDOT was already deeply confident we could execute. The proposal process took 6 months. I worked alongside our operations team, engineering leads, finance people. But a proposal is just paper. What matters is what lives behind it. I did 12 site visits. I drove to Northern Virginia and walked those corridors with engineers, understanding what was actually broken. I climbed into highway overpasses looking at concrete decades old, calculating what it would take to rebuild it right. And I took Linda, Thomas, and Prescott to lunch. Multiple lunches. I learned that Linda's daughter was going to law school at UVA working on civil rights. I asked about her cases months later. She asked why I remembered. I said because she'd told me something that mattered to her. I learned that Thomas had a boat on the Shenandoah River that he spent weekends on, that he'd been thinking about upgrading the engine but wasn't sure if it was worth the investment, that his wife wanted him to spend more time doing something that made him happy. I asked him about it months later. He told me he'd done it, said it had been the best decision, that now he actually had time to think, to be away from the office, to remember why he'd gotten into public works in the first place. I remembered. I asked how it was running. He smiled, not a polite smile, a real smile. I learned that Prescott was obsessed, genuinely obsessed, with 1970s baseball statistics. He could talk for hours about the '75 Reds, about Pete Rose's hitting consistency and Johnny Bench's power, and the way that team was constructed. He had opinions about baseball management that had nothing to do with infrastructure and everything to do with how he thought about problem solving and team dynamics. So I read about the '75 Reds. I watched some highlights. I knew who they were, what made them special, why that particular team mattered. When Prescott started talking about them, I didn't pretend to know. I didn't nod along like I understood. I asked real questions and listened to the answers. Because honestly, that was interesting to me too. I understood why he loved that team. And I understood why talking about that team with someone who actually cared enough to learn about it mattered to him. These aren't tricks. This isn't manipulation. This is just how you do business at this level. This is how you win deals that matter, contracts that change companies. You're not closing a contract. You're building a partnership that will outlast the contract itself. You're proving that when you say you understand someone's needs, you actually do understand them, because you've shown up and you've listened and you've remembered what matters to them. Not because it's useful, because it matters to them. By November 2024, the proposal was submitted. By December, VDOT came back with detailed questions. We answered every single one, fast, thorough, no bullshit. When we had limitations, we said so and explained how we'd work around them. Linda called to make sure she'd received our answers. She said the evaluation committee was impressed. By late December, I could feel something shifting. Linda called right before Christmas. "We're coming to you in the new year with news you want to hear." By March, Richard was already planning what this deal would mean operationally. He understood this was the deal. The single largest contract in Greymont's 30-year history. 2 weeks before the scheduled signing on April 29th, Linda called. The signing might accelerate. Could we be ready? Could I guarantee our executives would be available? The answer was obviously yes. This was 72 hours away. 72 hours until everything changed. I spent the weekend prepping with focused intensity. I pulled together a binder with every document VDOT might need, color-coded tabs, a checklist of every signature line. I coordinated with our CFO to make sure all financial certifications were in order. I called the legal team 3 times, Saturday, Sunday morning, Sunday night. No delays, no confusion. Monday morning, I sat down with Richard to walk through the final checklist. His office is on the 23rd floor of the Greymont Center, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the entire city. "Where are we?" he asked, not looking up from his spreadsheets. "Ready," I said. "VDOT might accelerate to tomorrow. I've got the full team prepped. We're locked and loaded." Richard nodded. I could see something relax in his shoulders. "Good," he said. "We're not losing this one." "We're not," I said. "I've been building this for 16 months. VDOT's with us because they believe in what I've shown them we can do." Richard looked up at me. There was acknowledgement in his eyes. Respect. "I know," he said. "That's why we're going to close it." I left his office at 9:15 a.m. I went back to my desk and sat down to wait. 48 hours, maybe less. At 10:30 a.m., Dominic Greymont's assistant called. Dominic had been back at Greymont for about 4 months. He'd spent 2 years at Stanford getting an MBA that he never let anyone forget, then 6 months at a startup in Silicon Valley. Richard had brought him in as chief strategy officer and said, "Fix what's broken." What Richard meant was, "Help us get better." What Dominic heard was, "I have permission to blow things up." I'd met Dominic twice before that Monday, once at a company all-hands where he gave a 20-minute presentation about legacy mindsets blocking growth that landed terribly with everyone who'd actually made the company profitable. Once on the elevator, where he told me he was excited to disrupt the industry. He was 28 years old. He'd never managed anything large. He'd never sold anything. But he had an MBA from INSEAD and 6 months at a startup, so apparently that made him qualified to be chief strategy officer. I went up to the 24th floor. Dominic's office was exactly what I expected. Standing desk, stark gray walls, expensive sneakers, a fitted black t-shirt with a logo I didn't recognize. He looked like someone had carefully constructed the visual image of a person who disrupts industries, which means he'd never actually disrupted anything that mattered. "Paul," he said, not offering a handshake, "thanks for coming up." "What's going on?" I said. "Look, I've been reviewing the portfolio," he said, and I could feel something shift, that tone. "And I want to be really direct with you about this because I think you deserve that." "Okay," I said. My stomach was tightening. "You're out. I'm 51 years old. I've spent 16 months cultivating a relationship about to become a $1.2 billion contract, and this kid just told me I'm fired." The words didn't make sense for a moment. "Can you be more specific?" I said, and I'm proud my voice didn't change. "Yeah, absolutely," he said, settling into his chair. "Your approach is obsolete. You're a relationship guy from an era when that meant something, but you're completely missing the strategic overlay that drives growth. Your pipeline is legacy activity. Slow, relationship-based, low-margin deals that don't scale. You're thinking like a dinosaur, Paul. We need people who think about infrastructure completely differently. Tech-enabled solutions, data-driven models, speed, not guys who spend 16 months nursing relationships. That's the old playbook. The market's changed. You haven't. You're trying to run a 2024 company with a 1990s playbook." I let him keep going. "Sometimes you let someone dig themselves into a hole fully, so there's no ambiguity later." "Look," he continued, "I get it. You built some real relationships, that's commendable. But relationships don't scale. Data scales. Algorithms scale. You can't build a billion-dollar company on handshakes. That worked when the world moved slower, when information was harder to find. But we have data now. We have systems. We have people who understand how to leverage technology and AI to do what you do manually and inefficiently. You're fighting against the wave of how business actually works now. That means letting go of people like you. The old guard. The dinosaurs. Here's the thing about being fired by someone who's wrong about you. You can feel it happening. You can feel the moment when you realize they're not going to change their mind. Not because of facts, because they're ignoring facts, but because they've already decided what the truth is. Dominic had decided relationships were obsolete. He'd decided data was the answer. Nothing I said in the next 72 hours would change that. The VDOT contract, I said. The one I've been working on for 16 months. The one we're signing Tuesday. Closes itself, Dominic said, with the absolute confidence of someone who has no idea what he's talking about. That deal is cooked. It's going to happen with or without you. What I'm trying to tell you is that your value has become marginal. I'm restructuring around a digital-first model, and frankly, you represent everything we're moving away from. Data is currency now, Paul. You don't have either of those. You're a liability, not an asset. He actually said this. 72 hours before the signing ceremony. My severance? I asked, keeping my voice level. Standard, 4 weeks pay, 2 weeks paid leave and 2 weeks to transition. Obviously, you won't be handling VDOT. We'll have someone else take that off your plate. Who? I asked. He waved a hand dismissively. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. He didn't have a name. The biggest deal in Greymont's history was about to be signed in 72 hours, and he was planning to figure it out. I'm going to mention this to your father, I said. You can, Dominic said, but he's out of the office, traveling back from Dallas. And also, he hired me to run strategy. This is my call. He trusts my judgment. There was nothing I could do. I went back down to the 16th floor. I called my assistant, Lauren, and told her to box up my personal items. I wrote a brief email saying I was moving on to new opportunities. I meant that last part, actually. Greymont did have a strong pipeline. I'd built it, and now Dominic was probably going to burn it down. By 11:15 a.m., I had my personal items in a box. Some photos from over the years, me at client events, me with Linda and Thomas at a VDOT event last year, me at a Greymont holiday party that felt like it was 10 years ago instead of 3 months. A few awards I'd won. A coffee mug I'd had since my Charlotte days, the one with a fading logo from a firm that didn't exist anymore, that I'd held on to through 3 job changes because it reminded me that I'd been good at this once. A stress ball shaped like a bridge from a civil engineering conference in 2019. A picture of my family on my desk, which I almost left behind but picked up at the last second. My key card would stop working by noon. I could feel something tighten in my chest thinking about that. Not because I was sentimental about the building, but because being unable to get back in would make it official. By 11:20, I was walking out of the Greymont Center lobby onto West Peachtree Street, carrying a cardboard box that contained 16 years of my professional life. The sun was bright. April in Atlanta, so it was already warm. I remember thinking that it was a surprisingly nice day for the worst professional moment of my life. The security guard at the desk looked at me with that expression that security guards get when they're not supposed to ask why you're leaving, but they can tell something went wrong. I didn't look at him. I just walked out into the Atlanta morning. I walked to the parking garage, got into my 2019 Lexus I'd paid off 3 years earlier, and just sat there with the box on my passenger seat. Just sitting there, trying to process the fact that I'd gone from being 2 days away from closing the biggest deal in company history to being unemployed, fired by a kid who didn't understand the first thing about how business actually works. My phone started ringing. It was Lauren. "Paul," she said, and there was an edge in her voice. "VDOT just called the main reception desk." My stomach did something that felt like a sideways flip. "They asked for you specifically," Lauren said. "The receptionist told them you weren't available, and the call got confused and it ended up going to Dominic's assistant. But Paul, they said Commissioner Prescott wants to talk to you about moving up the signing to tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. Not Tuesday. Tomorrow. And Paul, they sounded urgent." I didn't say anything. I was processing this. The thing I'd been building for 16 months was now accelerating by 36 hours. The one person at Greymont who understood this deal was sitting in a parking garage, legally fired, with a box of his life on the passenger seat. "Lauren, call VDOT back," I said. "The main number. Ask for Linda Martinez directly. See if you can figure out what Commissioner Prescott actually said. Get me specifics." "Okay," Lauren said. "But Paul, if Dominic finds out I'm helping you, that's going to be weird." "Dominic's an idiot," I said. "Call Linda. Figure out what's happening. Call me back." I hung up and sat there in the car, watching people move through the Atlanta streets, watching the Greymont Center rise up above me. Somewhere in that building, Dominic was probably adjusting his dashboard, already moving on to the next person he'd decided was holding Graymont back. He had no idea that the biggest deal in company history was about to blow up in his face. He had no idea that the very contract he'd just told me was cooked and didn't need me was about to accelerate by more than a day. Lauren called me back at 11:47 a.m. "Okay," she said. "I got Linda. Here's what she said. Commissioner Prescott has a scheduling conflict Thursday that would push the signing back to May, which is not acceptable for political reasons. Something about a vote or appropriations deadline. They've decided they want to execute the contract tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in Richmond. They're asking if Graymont's full team can be available." Linda said Commissioner Prescott specifically asked for you to be there to handle the execution. She said, "We need Paul there. He understands this deal better than anyone." One day earlier, 36 hours instead of 72. "Did Linda sound concerned?" I asked. "About what?" "About whether we could make it happen." "No," Lauren said. She sounded pretty confident. She said, "Paul's never let us down. If Paul says it's ready, it's ready." Those were her exact words, Paul, not Graymont, Paul. That was the problem right there. That was the entire situation in a single sentence. VDOT wasn't choosing Graymont because Graymont was the best company or the most innovative or the most data-driven. VDOT was choosing Graymont because I'd spent 16 months proving that Graymont was the company they could trust. "Lauren, email me a copy of every document from the VDOT file," I said. "The full proposal, the contract drafts, the financial breakdown, the commitment letters, everything. Can you do that?" "Yeah," she said. "Paul, be careful." I started the car. I drove to a Starbucks 3 blocks away and ordered a coffee I didn't actually want. By the time I had the coffee in my hands, Lauren had sent me a download link to a shared folder with 247 files inside it. Every contract document, every email, every technical specification, every commitment we'd made, every minute of work that had gone into this deal over 16 months. All of it in one place. Back at the Graymont Center, something else was happening. Richard had been in Dallas working on a partnership negotiation. He'd booked a flight back to Atlanta scheduled to land at 3:47 p.m. By the time he landed, everything was already in motion. By the time he turned his phone back on, Michelle was waiting for him. What I learned later was that Richard called his assistant the moment he walked off the tarmac. His assistant's name is Michelle. She's been with Richard for 11 years. She's the only person at Graymont who actually tells Richard when he's wrong. Richard asked, "Where's Paul? He should be prepping for the VDOT signing tomorrow." And Michelle said, "Dominic fired him this morning." There's a moment in every story like this where someone's entire worldview realigns in about 4 seconds. That was Richard's moment. The elevator ride suddenly felt like a collapse. Richard didn't ask why. He asked, "Where is he now?" "I don't know. He left around 11:30. "Get him on the phone," Richard said. "Now." And that's when I got a call from an unknown number. I was still in the Starbucks, laptop open, looking at 247 files. The unknown number was Richard Graymont. "Paul?" he said, voice like ice. "Yeah," I said. "Where are you?" "A Starbucks on West Peachtree, about 3 blocks from the office." "Stay there," Richard said. "I'm coming to you." He hung up. No small talk. Richard showed up at the Starbucks at 4:23 p.m. He walked in wearing a travel suit and a face that looked like someone had just told him the Graymont Center was on fire. He ordered a black coffee and sat down across from me without asking if he could sit. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, looking at me, looking at the box on the chair next to me. "Tell me about the VDOT deal," he said. So I told him. I told him about Linda and the 16-month relationship building. I told him about the 2 years before that, the 2 years of building trust before this deal even existed. I told him about showing up, about learning what mattered to them. I told him about the acceleration, that VDOT was so confident they were willing to adjust their entire schedule. I told him that Dominic had fired me this morning based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what actually drives infrastructure deals at this scale, what actually makes government entities willing to sign billion-dollar contracts. I told him that somewhere in his office his son was probably treating a call from VDOT like a routine scheduling matter, with no idea that this particular call represented $1.2 billion and the future of his company. Richard didn't interrupt. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup as I talked. When I was done, he sat there for about 10 seconds without saying anything. I watched his face move through 5 different emotions: surprise, anger, realization, and then something worse than anger. Something that looked like the moment when a parent realizes their judgment about their own child has been catastrophically wrong. He picked up his coffee and took a sip. It was cold. He didn't care. "What do you need?" he said. "To handle this, I need to be in Richmond tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with full signing authority," I said. "I need our CFO there. I need our chief legal counsel. I need everything confirmed in writing. And I need Dominic to understand that he doesn't actually know what he's doing, and that if he goes anywhere near this deal, he's going to burn $1.2 billion straight to the ground." "Understood," Richard said. "What else?" "I need a moment to talk to my attorney about what was just done to me, because firing someone on the eve of closing a $1.2 billion deal they've been building for 16 months is probably not a legally clean move." "No," Richard said quietly. "It's not." Richard stood up. He left money on the table. He looked at me across that corner table, and I could see something in his face that looked like respect. "You're not fired," he said. Then he left to go tell his son that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his very short career. Richard didn't call me back until 11:30 p.m. 9 hours of silence. 9 hours where I was sitting in my apartment with a box of personal items and a copy of every VDOT contract document on my laptop, refreshing my email obsessively. What was happening? Richard was having a conversation with his son about the difference between strategy and arrogance, about understanding your actual domain versus reading about it in business books, about the gap between theory and reality. Dominic apparently wanted to defend his decision. He apparently actually believed what he'd said about relationship-based business being obsolete. Richard let him finish. Let him go through his whole pitch about optimization and disruption and why the old way doesn't work anymore. Then Richard walked him through the VDOT situation, minute by minute. Not as a punishment, but the way you would explain something to someone who genuinely didn't understand it. He explained what Linda Martinez represented, not just a contact, but a decision-maker convinced over 2 years that we could be trusted. He explained what pre-selection meant, that we weren't competing with 16 companies, we were competing with 3. He explained what Commissioner Prescott's confidence was based on. He explained what the acceleration meant, that VDOT was so confident they were willing to adjust their entire schedule. By the time Richard was done explaining how his son had nearly incinerated $1.2 billion while trying to optimize corporate efficiency, Dominic's arguments just evaporated. You could see it happen. The confidence drained out of him. He realized he'd made a catastrophic error based on incomplete information and an ideology that didn't match reality. When Richard called, he didn't do small talk. "We need to talk about your return," he said. "Okay," I said. "This can happen one of 2 ways. You can take your job back as senior director, and we move forward like this morning didn't happen. Or we can have a different conversation where you get something else, something that reflects what you're actually worth, what this day actually cost you, and what it proves about who you are." I wasn't going back to senior director, not after this. Going back would feel like forgiving him, like accepting the narrative he'd written about me being obsolete. "What's the other conversation?" I asked. "Tell me what you need," Richard said. "Tell me what you actually want." So I told him. I told him that I needed an equity stake in the company, real equity, not options that would vest over 7 years, not something contingent on performance reviews, real shares. I told him I needed a title that reflected the actual value I brought, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, with direct board reporting. And I told him I needed a written agreement that my relationships were company assets that would be protected and respected going forward. "The equity," Richard said. "What percentage?" 2%, I said. "Liquid eligible. That means if Graymont ever goes public or gets acquired, I can actually cash out." Richard was quiet. I could hear him thinking, calculating, weighing what this meant. Then he said, 1.5%. Liquid eligible. Vests immediately. VP of Strategic Partnerships with board reporting. And we put something in writing that establishes your relationships as IP owned by the company, but protected by a clause that specifies those relationships cannot be unilaterally severed or reassigned without your consent. No one, including me, can reassign you to someone else without your agreement. That's my offer. I thought about it for about 3 seconds. 1.5 was slightly less than I asked for, but it vested immediately, and it was liquid eligible. And the protection clause was actually more valuable than the percentage, because it meant no future CEO could do what Dominic tried to do. "What about Dominic?" I asked. "Dominic," Richard said carefully, "is going to be reassigned to head up our operations optimization division. If he can't handle that responsibility either, Then we'll have a different conversation about his future here. We had a deal. The actual legal work took 3 days. By Monday night, I had a new contract sitting in front of me and an equity agreement that made me a partial owner of Graymont Infrastructure Group. I wasn't just a senior employee, I was an actual shareholder, someone whose fate was tied to Graymont's success. Monday night, after I left Richard's office, I called Linda. I didn't tell her what had happened. I just said, "I wanted you to hear directly from me. I'll be in Richmond tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Everything's confirmed on our end. We're ready." "Paul," she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like relief. "I'm glad to hear that. Commissioner Prescott really wanted to make sure you'd be there." "I'll be there," I said. "I promise." And I meant it. I'd made promises to Linda, Thomas, and Commissioner Prescott. I'd made them over 2 years of conversations and site visits and follow-ups, and I wasn't going to break them because someone's 28-year-old son thought relationships were obsolete. Tuesday morning at 7 a.m., I drove to Richmond with Richard, our CFO Jennifer Torres, and our Chief Counsel Stephen Chen. Jennifer brought the financial certifications. Stephen brought the legal documents. I brought the relationships. The drive took about 2.5 hours. Richard was quiet, focused, thinking through what this deal meant and what it meant that we'd nearly lost it. We had a leather portfolio with every document VDOT needed, every signature line flagged in color-coded tabs. We had the full weight of Graymont's authority behind us. Commissioner Prescott was waiting in the VDOT offices at 8:55 a.m. Linda Martinez was there. Thomas Chen was there. They looked relieved to see me. Not relieved to see Richard, not relieved to see Jennifer or Stephen, relieved to see me. Because that meant the person they'd been building a relationship with, the person they trusted, was still in the game. "Paul," Commissioner Prescott said, shaking my hand firmly, "I wasn't entirely sure you'd make it." "There was a moment when I wasn't sure either," I said. "But you did," Linda said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "Thank you for being at the table where it matters." We signed the contract at 9:23 a.m. $1.2 billion. The single largest contract in Graymont's 30-year history. My signature was on that contract. Richard's was. Jennifer's was. Stephen's was. They were signing because I'd built relationships with people who believed that Graymont could deliver. By 10:15, we were driving back to Atlanta with the signed contract in the portfolio on my lap. Richard was actually smiling. Not a big smile. Richard doesn't do big smiles. But a smile nonetheless. "You did it," he said. "We did," I said. "You're the one who fixed it. You're the one who understood what was at stake and fixed it while I was sitting in a Starbucks." "I created the problem," Richard said quietly. "All I did was correct it." That's the thing about being the CEO of a major company. You get credit for the wins, but you also get to understand completely that the wins aren't about you. They're about the people who know how to actually do the work. And sometimes it takes almost losing everything to realize that the person you're about to lose was actually the only one who knew where all the pieces were. Richard understood something that morning that Dominic never understood. Business isn't a competition against people. Business is a partnership with people on the other side of the table. And once you damage those partnerships, they don't come back easily. Relationships aren't bugs you can optimize out. They're the system. They're how the system actually works. Dominic was reassigned to operations optimization. It was technically a promotion, but everyone knew it was an exile. By late July, he actually did leave, took a job at a private equity firm. I heard he lasted about 8 months there before they realized an MBA and 6 months at a startup doesn't teach you how to fix broken companies or manage experienced people. Doesn't teach you humility. Me? I stayed at Graymont. I closed 4 more major contracts over the next 18 months. The City of Raleigh water system upgrade, $300 million. A bridge rehabilitation project in Kentucky. A highway expansion in West Virginia. Contracts that came through because people believed in Graymont. Because they believed in me. I brought in $280 million in additional revenue in that period alone. Not because I was right about how business works. Not because data and technology don't matter. They absolutely do. The modern infrastructure business requires all of that. Algorithms help. Data helps. Speed helps. But all of that is worthless if the person on the other side of the table doesn't believe you'll deliver. If they don't trust you. Because trust is what actually prevents projects from collapsing. What keeps timelines reasonable, what ensures quality. By the time I turned 53, I was the second largest shareholder in Graymont Infrastructure Group. Not because I was smarter than anyone else, not because I worked harder, but because I was patient. Because I understood something fundamental about how business actually works at scale. The biggest deals in the world aren't closed in meetings. They're closed in the months and years that happen before the meeting. They're closed in the relationships you build, in the trust you establish, in the small moments where you demonstrate that you're the kind of person who actually cares about the other person's success. And when the person across the table needs to know that they can trust you, really trust you, not corporate trust, but personal trust, you don't ever give them a reason not to. You show up on time. You remember what they said last time. You follow through on what you promised. You don't cut corners. You don't oversell. You don't use fancy language to hide weaknesses. You just do the work. Richard and I had lunch occasionally after that. One of those lunches, about 2 years after the VDOT deal closed, he asked me why I'd stayed calm when Dominic fired me. Because I knew the deal was real, I said. And I knew that the people I'd built the relationship with understood that I was the one who'd made it real. Dominic could fire me, but he couldn't fire the relationship. It was bigger than him. It was bigger than the company. It was just a thing that existed between me and Linda and Thomas and Commissioner Prescott. And I knew that eventually someone was going to realize that eventually someone important was going to realize that you can't just substitute one person for another when the entire foundation of the deal is based on trust. You trusted that? Richard asked. He sounded genuinely curious. I trusted that, yeah. I trusted it because I'd built it. I knew it was real. Dominic didn't understand it. He'd looked at a spreadsheet and decided he understood everything. But understanding a business based on a spreadsheet is like understanding a person based on their resume. You can get some data points, but you don't get the real picture. Richard nodded slowly. That's a lesson I should have taught him, he said quietly. Maybe, I said. Or maybe it's a lesson you can't teach anyone who hasn't earned it yet. You have to live it. You have to spend months building something, prove to yourself that it's real, realize that it's fragile, and understand that you're the one responsible for protecting it. And that, I think, is the thing nobody understands when they're young. You can read all the books about disruption and optimization and digital strategy. All of that is real and matters. New technologies are valuable, data is valuable, speed is valuable. But at the end of the day, the person who builds relationships, who shows up, who remembers what matters to the other person, who follows through on every single commitment, even when it costs them, that person wins. Not always fast, not always in a way that looks impressive on a PowerPoint, not always in a way that looks like disruption or innovation, but eventually, that person wins. That person closes the deal. That person gets the call that changes everything. That person walks into a signing ceremony and the first thing people ask for is them.